Well, thank you for coming this evening. It's my pleasure today this evening to introduce Craig Manson, the Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks. And I think I'd like to share something that I learned today about Mr. Manson, and that turns out we both had a shared interest in, we're early in our careers, we're wannabe marine biologists, and he spent some time at Pacific Grove, as did I. It's a small world. Craig Manson is the Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. In that capacity, he oversees the National Park Service and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, where he's responsible for 384 national parks and over 500 national wildlife refuges, covering a total area of 178 million acres in the continental United States, as well as Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Virgin Islands. And he returns just recently from Guam, where he was dealing with issues like the brown tree snake and other exotic issues. He represents the Secretary of the Interior on various boards, commissions, and task force. He previously served as a judge of the Superior Court of California in Sacramento from 1998 to 2002. And prior to that, he was the General Counsel of the California Department of Fish and Game. So he has long and deep roots in issues related to natural resources. He practiced law in Sacramento from 1989 to 1993. A graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, Mr. Manson served on active duty in the Air Force from 1976 to 1989 and is presently a colonel in the Air National Guard. He received his law degree with great distinction from the University of the Pacific. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Craig Manson.
Thank you very much, Mike. It is a tremendous honor to be here tonight and to participate in this conference, and I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors and the Bren School and UCSB for putting on and sponsoring and organizing this conference. I appreciate being among the great minds and the diversity of views here. One of the things that I have experienced in my public life is that people of diverse views seldom talk to each other. Somebody said to me this morning, "You mean Kira never calls you?" And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here with so many folks of diverse views, and I have learned a number of things this day, and I'm going to be here tomorrow as well because I want to continue to learn more. As Mike alluded to, I am familiar with this part of California, and I graduated from high school in Monterey and spent some time in and around Monterey, and I really appreciate the great beauty and ecological values of the coast, and flirted with the idea of becoming a marine biologist early on, urged on by a biology teacher with whom I'm still in touch. He emails me and from time to time and tells me the things that he likes and the things that he doesn't like that the administration is doing. Sends me grades still. And it's really a great experience. Well, a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving, a group of smart people gathered under the auspices of UCSB to talk about important issues while a controversial war rages overseas. And I'm not talking about the present. I'm talking about my first visit to Santa Barbara 31 years ago. And there was no ESA back then. It was in the pre-ESA era. And this morning, Holly Doremus talked a little bit about what that pre-ESA era was like, the state of the world then, And I'd like to add another factor that will become important later on, so keep it in mind. Another thing about the world 30 years or more ago was that O.J. Simpson was just a football player. Now, you may wonder what that has to do with the Endangered Species Act. Well, I'll tie it all together in just a minute. And then, of course, in 1973, President Nixon signed into law the Endangered Species Act. One of the people that I am also in contact with from time to time is a fellow that some of you know. He served as Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks during the Nixon administration. And he was sort of a controversial fellow then and remains so now. Out of respect, I won't mention his name, but he lives in Florida and gives me advice from time to time. He was telling me about a trip that he took to Rome recently, and when I told him I was coming out here, he felt that he wanted to give me the full details about this trip that he took to Rome and a subsequent trip out here. It seems that when he went to Rome, he met the Pope, and he and the Pope got along quite famously, and as a matter of fact, they got along so famously that the Pope offered him a special deal. He could talk to God on a special phone that the Pope had. And so he, the Assistant Secretary, jumped at this opportunity, and he had a wonderful experience speaking with the Creator. And later on, the Pope came to America, and the Assistant Secretary brought him out here to Santa Barbara. And they had a fabulously famous time out here as well. And at the end of their time here, just before the Pope had to go back to Rome, this particular former Assistant Secretary asked the Pope if he too wanted to talk to God, and the Pope said, well, I appreciate you offering me the opportunity, but I forgot to bring my calling card. And the former Assistant Secretary said, well, that's okay, because you see, from Santa Barbara, it is a local call. I miss Governor Kempthorne when he was here. I did hear the things that he had to say, and I missed him because of weather delayed my flights, and I will have some comments about some of the things that he said. I do think that, as was alluded to earlier today, it is extremely appropriate that this conference is here at the Bren School of Management, as Dean Aegon talked about, and for all of the other reasons that the Dean and Secretary Babbitt mentioned about the NCCP, this is a most appropriate spot. I had the pleasure of serving in Governor Wilson's administration during the time that the NCCP came about, and participating in a number of the issues surrounding the planning and the legal aspects of the NCCP. And I'm a great fan of that program and the things that led to it. One of the things that I've found is that sometimes in public life it's necessary to spell out in plain language where you are and what you stand for. So I'm going to do that before I get into the substance of my remarks. First, let me say that it's been a productive conference already, because I've discovered that a number of things that I plan to say have already been said. And of course, in Washington, there is the famous admonition that sometimes everything's been said, but not everyone said it. So I'll go ahead and take the liberty of saying some of the things anyway. Although I was concerned enough to go back to my room to find out if Frank Davis and Mark Schaefer and Dale Goebel and Bruce Babbitt had stolen my notes out of my room. But anyway, to lay out clearly where I stand, here's tomorrow's headline, I hope. Bush official says he's for the ESA. Because that's true. I want to preface my remarks by talking just briefly, if I may, quote Aldo Leopold, who was the founder of the field of conservation biology. In the Sand County Almanac, he said, "A conservation biologist, or conservationist, is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke he is writing his signature upon the face of his land." At the heart of Leopold's conservation ethic was this poetic call to citizens to take responsibility and become stewards of the land. And pressures, of course, since the 1940s have increased correspondingly on undeveloped land and water and wildlife. And we know, of course, that public lands are not the only places to protect species. We've come to realize that we have to work in partnership with people who farm and ranch and log on public lands, and that working landscapes are important to the preservation of species, and that for conservation to be successful, we have to involve the people who live on and work on the land. And that informs President Bush's vision of a nation of citizen conservationists, that successful conservation is a partnership between the people and the government. And the government's role is to empower the people to take conservation into their own hands. It's a concept that puts collaboration ahead of polarization. So the goal in our administration is to improve the implementation of the ESA, to enhance the focus on recovery, to protect habitat, and to, at the same time, reduce unnecessary bureaucratic process. So here are the talking points. We're committed to the recovery of species. We're committed to the preservation of habitat. At the same time, we have opportunities across the country to change the dynamic of how we implement the ESA, to move toward an era of cooperative conservation that achieves significant benefits for partners while for species while respecting the needs and interests of partners. We've learned from experience that we can do a better job of protecting species by involving states, tribes, landowners, businesses, conservation organizations, and work through incentive-based programs and conservation agreements and enhanced funding. And that recovery of listed species, which is the true measure of success, and I'll have some comments about exactly what recovery means in a moment, will largely depend upon the beneficial and often voluntary actions of states and landowners and others to preserve and restore habitat. It will depend upon partnerships and other innovative approaches to conservation. It will be dependent upon the creativity and flexibility of regulatory agencies. And it will depend upon the good stewardship of private landowners. So I was asked to talk about evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of the Act. The Act is at its zenith in protecting a few species against obvious threats, and at its nadir in dealing with complex problems that implicate other aspects of public policy, economics, and sociology. And in between, it does a pretty good job, but it can do an even better job. The administration of the Endangered Species Act is a public policy issue, and if we fail to view it in that context, we will ultimately fail species conservation. It's interesting to me, as I've listened today, that the most innovative approaches to complex problems under the ESA, these innovative approaches, in a sense, go beyond the statute, or reach outside the statute, or reach around the statute. Things like NCCP and no surprises, although rooted in the statute, tend to reach outside it and beyond it and around it. It tells me that at age 30, the ESA is in need of adaptive public policy. And in fact, what I've heard here today is that a new model is emerging, and that new model relies heavily on collaboration. Let me talk about how we can improve the administration of the ESA and strengthen it, and talk about some of the things that I've heard here today. First, recovery. I refer to that as the true measure of success. And I heard here today that we need to understand what recovery really means, and that perhaps a true measure of success, it was suggested by some, is not merely getting species off the list as quickly as we can. And in fact, I agree with that. I don't think that we are about to embark upon a wave of unsupported listings, delistings. On the other hand, I think that we cannot hold up one supported by science. I'm intrigued by the idea of conservation-dependent species, a category of species that, while not recovered to the point where they no longer need the protections of the Act, may have reached a point in their conservation where they're no longer in decline and may call for a different treatment or a different category. It's an idea that I think is worth further discussion, and I hope that as we continue here into tomorrow, either explicitly or during breaks, we have that discussion. Science, sound science. That's a phrase that our administration has used and that others have used, and some use it to mean the science that they want. On the other hand, it does have real meaning. I've heard the phrase regulatory science used in a variety of contexts, and it is, in fact, an important phrase to understand. One of the things that I think I heard Dennis Murphy say was that sometimes there's been a disconnect between scientists and policymakers. And this is something that I have certainly observed myself. There is a difference between scientific decisions and science-based or science-informed decisions. And one of the things that's important is the need to have scientists and policymakers understand each other, to learn to speak each other's language, or at least to understand each other's needs, that the policymakers learn to understand the right questions to ask of the scientists, that the scientists learn to understand the needs of policymakers when presenting science that will be used in a regulatory context. In this respect, these interdisciplinary programs, such as that here at the Bren School, are tremendously important. And I've become aware of other such disciplinary programs around the country, and this, I think, cannot be understated as important to the future of the administration of the Endangered Species Act. It's important for scientists to understand the regulatory regime. It's important for policymakers to understand the scientific method. And only in that way will we really have sound science in the sense that we mean it when we talk about it in our administration. O.J. Simpson. In 1973, O.J. Simpson was just another football player. Well, he wasn't just another football player. He was a pretty doggone good football player. But the only three initials other than his first two that were ever associated with him were NFL. Well, by the 20th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, three other initials were associated with O.J. Simpson, unfortunately, and those were DNA. Now, this is important because by the mid-90s, DNA was on everybody's mind who watched television or was upright and walking in America. The fact is that, except for those people who paid attention in high school biology, nobody else in 1973 really cared much about DNA in the general public. The significance of that is that when the ESA became law, the field of genetics was barely contemplated in terms of its effect on the Endangered Species Act. And of course, today, it plays a great role in listing decisions. The DPS policy relies heavily on genetics, and to some extent, even critical habitat designations have a connection to genetics. However, the way in which genetics is used and understood in the Endangered Species Act is not well understood. And frankly, there is little guidance as to the appropriate role that genetics ought to play in the regulatory scheme of the Endangered Species Act. So in that sense, that is a weakness of the current implementation of the Act. And there needs to be guidance, there needs to be thought, there needs to be discussion about the role of genetics in the implementation of the Endangered Species Act. HCPs. Here's another headline. Bush official in favor of habitat conservation plans. But. Here's the but. The current process for getting through habitat conservation plans is too long and too complicated in all but the large landscape-based programs. In that sense, the NCCP program, in a sense, may have been too successful. It's not necessary that every HCP replicate the NCCP. Not every HCP, not every Section 10 permit has to be a large landscape-based plan. Virginia Albrecht was saying this morning that her clients now favor Section 7 and do everything that they can to find a federal nexus where one ordinarily would not otherwise exist. We've got to do something to make the HCP process once again affordable and useful for small landowners. And Michael Bean noted that the HCP process may not be useful for those who have to deal with working landscapes. And we've got to spend some time figuring out that aspect of it as well. And now, the star of the show, critical habitat. Here's the headline. Habitat. Bush official says he's for it. But critical habitat, as I have said, is not to be confused with habitat. And in fact, if I may say the following, critical habitat designation has proven to be a controversial and costly, yet largely toothless, means of furthering conservation of listed species. Nothing focuses and energizes controversy more than having government agencies draw lines on maps, and the required economic analysis adds significant costs to listing actions. At the same time, the duty for federal agencies to avoid adversely modifying habitat has provided little, if any, additional protection beyond that provided by the requirement that they avoid jeopardizing a listed species' existence, because the two have been defined to have the same meaning. Critical habitat designation has become the tail that wags the dog of listing species. That's actually not me talking. That's Jeff Curtis and Bob Davison in Open Space Quarterly, the Endangered Species Act, 30 Years on the Ark. Further see Babbitt remarks earlier today. An interesting thing happened about a year and a half ago. Some of you in this room joined me out at Shepherdstown, West Virginia. The Defenders was represented there. The home builders were represented there. It was a broad spectrum of interest there, and we got together under the auspices of the Keystone Center to talk a little bit about the economic analysis issues concerning critical habitat. As it turned out, we never got to the economic analysis issues because we spent the whole time discussing just what did Congress mean by the critical habitat provisions in the first place. So there you have it. I won't say anything more about that, except to say that the GAO report recently released on critical habitat and listing says that the agency needs guidance on critical habitat designations. Guidance is on the way before the end of the year. Finally, partnerships and incentives. I said earlier that, for the most part, in this new era of collaboration, effective protection of habitat and conservation of species will rely on the voluntary efforts often of private landowners and the partnership efforts of non-governmental organizations and states as well. And we've put considerable money into that aspect of things in the Landowner Incentive Program, the Private Stewardship Grant Program, and a variety of other grant programs that go under the general rubric of our Cooperative Conservation Initiative. States. When I was at California Department of Fish and Game, I looked at Section 6 of the Federal Endangered Species Act and thought then that it was something more than a mechanism to pass through money to the states. I thought it represented a potential substantive grant of authority to the states that could be used just as it's been described here by a variety of speakers. I still hold that view, and we are prepared in this administration to engage in the discussion with the states, with other interested parties, about how that might work in terms of giving the states authority in a program that would follow some of the guidelines that Mark Schaefer talked about earlier today. And I hope that I have the opportunity to have other conversations while I'm here with other folks about that idea. So once again, I think we are in a new era of Endangered Species Act implementation, one of collaboration, one that may culminate years and years and years from now when we will look back and say, you know, once there was a time when they had a law that prohibited certain things, and isn't that amazing that they had a law like that that wasn't very collaborative? But isn't it also amazing that the law was flexible enough and the folks who dealt with it, the agencies, the academics, the NGOs, the landowners, and people who cared, were able to develop a cooperative and collaborative approach within the framework of that law. And now we have conserved and recovered and continue to conserve and recovered species using that particular model. I hope that day comes years and years and years from now, and that we look back on this era as the beginning of that point in time. Thank you very much. Yeah.
You want to entertain questions? Do you have any questions for the Assistant Secretary?
Well, collaboration seems to be the...
Wait,
Sorry about that. Collaboration seems to be the biggest C of the 4 C's coming out of the Secretary's office, and it's repeated quite often. And yet I think, you know, the vision you have of looking back upon a time when we had laws that compelled people, another C, to do things without necessarily relying upon collaboration as a primary mechanism, suggests that there was some time in which power relationships among the parties were different, and their motivations and incentives to engage in protecting these habitats and these creatures were different. I wonder if you could comment on the absence of any NCCP processes in California in the past 10 years where there wasn't an endangered species, some regulatory threat that brought parties to the table to engage in the kind of collaborative process that we did see there, but which has not been forthcoming in any California counties or cities where they might preventively address these issues collaboratively, but seem uninterested until they're compelled to.
Well, I think every circumstance is different, and I will certainly say that, you know, I do not doubt and I will not deny that there are circumstances where folks don't see the value in collaboration. I think by and large, however, people yearn for less command and control overall, and that when people understand that their best interests are at heart, that when there is the availability of a process that is open and collaborative, people will always opt for that instead of the other process. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my view of it.
Other questions?
Boy, I'm getting off easy tonight.
One of the important aspects of the President's policy towards excuse me, endangered species is involving the states, as you mentioned. But in this conference, there's been a repeated distrust of the states and their intentions with regard to endangered species. So my question is, does the Fish and Wildlife Service or Interior play a role in improving that situation? Can the Fish and Wildlife Service help motivate the states to increase the statutes or regulations that protect endangered species at the state level?
Well, I think that one of the things that we can do, and we have been doing to one degree or another, is working with states that are interested to bring them to the point where they have sufficient capacity to deal with these issues. And we've done that in some individual cases, but we've done that a lot by working through the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And I think that is probably the best forum that we can use to encourage and empower states.
Karen?
I apologize for not calling you earlier, by the way.
Okay. Actually, I apologize for not calling you. It is a two-way street, you know.
Here's, I talked to you earlier about the fact that, the Fish and Wildlife Service has said it needs $153 million to deal with the backlog of listings and critical habitats. Back in 1990, the Inspector General at the Department of Interior said they needed $144 million. And so we've known for a long time a lot of money is needed. Yet the budget for doing listings and critical habitats has declined from being steadily around 20% in the 80s to 3% of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's core budget. And if you account for inflation, the Fish and Wildlife Service has about the same amount of money today as it had in 1993 and had in about 1981. And so basically, if we believe that listing is a critical part of the Act, and I won't talk about critical habitat, but if we believe that listing is a critical part of the Act, what can we do to get the agency the resources it needs to do the job? Because right now, they're not getting nearly enough money to do this critical aspect. And as long as they don't have that money, we're going to be in continual crisis. Congress has been willing to allocate the money. There's a very close correlation between how much is allocated and how much is asked. Earlier this year, the Congress actually invited the administration to submit a supplemental appropriation, which didn't happen. And it just seems to me that we constantly struggle over this issue. It's a constant point of controversy. The agency said how much money it needs, and we can resolve this by getting them the money. And you're not in control of Congress, obviously, but it seems to me the administration can do more to make that budget request, to outline, say, a 5-year program to get the job done, to lobby, and to set the wheels in motion to get all the species listed that need to be listed, and, of course, designate the critical habitats that you love so much. So I'd like to hear your opinion of how to deal with this budget crisis.
Well, I haven't done the math, but I'll assume that your math is correct. I would say a couple of things here. First, I think we have a fundamental difference over whether listing is a critical part of the agency's job in this sense. It certainly is important to the administration of the Act, but another way to look at that in terms of the responsibility of the Fish and Wildlife Service is that it's just as important to keep species from getting to the point where they're in need of listing. And in terms of public policy, a decision has to be made in terms of where you spend your money. Do you spend, given that budgets are finite, do you spend more money in things like the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program with the aim of keeping some species off the list, or do you put more money into the listing program? It's a public policy decision, and people can differ over where we've drawn the lines. We've drawn the line in favor of partnership programs to try and keep species off the list. The other thing is that there will never be enough money from a public policy point of view in any lifetime in this room to list all of the species that anyone believes need to be listed. The fact is that that's not where any Congress anytime soon is going to draw the lines. So we do the best that we can with finite budgets and make adjustments where we can, and I think the fact is that regardless of administration, you are not going to see significant increases in listing budgets anytime in the near future.
Jeff, Jeff Eisenberg with the Catalan. There's fairly broad consensus within the group that the ESA is not working procedurally and that there's reforms that could be put in place legislatively to make it more efficient. Yet what we also hear is that the administration has been reluctant to get behind to make a political push to make those reforms happen on the Hill. Is there any comment you'd like to make on that subject?
Yeah, I think, I wasn't here, but I understand that Governor Kempthorne analyzed this issue a little bit last night, and if I'm right about what I understand that he said, I understand that he may have said that it's unlikely that there will be any significant legislative reform of the ESA anytime soon. My political analysis concurs with that, and there may be some opportunity for some limited, specific, targeted issues about which there may be some broad consensus. But I have said to members of my own party on Capitol Hill that that only works as long as everybody doesn't take the opportunity to hang every other idea that they ever had about the ESA on some limited specific bill, which I think there are people who will have a hard time resisting that on both sides of the aisle. So for that reason, I don't see any realistic opportunity in the near term or even in the midterm, looking out a few years, for any likely legislative changes to the ESA. We would prefer to spend our time and effort on things that we know that we can do in terms of administrative and policy reforms to implementation processes.
Yes, thank you. Steve Schneider from Stanford. We've heard the two good phrases over and over again, and I agree with them, collaboration and sound science. But collaboration probably requires at least the perception among the people trying to collaborate about what are their shared beliefs about what is sound and, of course, what is unsound. And as a person who works in climate, I can tell you that very unfortunately in that field, that mantra of sound science or unsound science has been grabbed by two very diametrically opposed groups. One, you could say, represented by sort of NRC reports, and another one by a small group of scientists funded largely through industry and other areas, each one making strong claims about what is sound science and the other one isn't. And because they're so diametrical, it's very difficult for any collaboration. So I wonder, in the endangered species area, where are the agreements possible on what is sound and where is unsound, so that we could begin that shared perception that could actually lead to the collaboration that I think you rightly point to.
Well, you raise an interesting question. One of the things that I don't mean to get on the case of scientists, but indulge me for a minute.
Feel free.
One of the things that scientists, I think, have to learn to live with, and most do, but some do not, and that is a degree of ambiguity. And I say that having come from an experience where I used to teach law to science and engineering undergrads who used to come in every semester and say, "Oh, we hate this stuff. It's fuzzy studies," they would say. "There are no equations. The answers are always different." And, I foster some of that by saying anybody can be a lawyer by learning two words, which are, "it depends." The fact is, by the end of the semester, my science and engineering undergrads would say, "We love this stuff," because I would show them that there are equations in the law. There are things in the law that can be replicated and yield at least similar results by plugging in similar facts, and that in science there is a degree of ambiguity, and that sometimes you have to say, "I don't know." And, what we all have to do, if we're going to talk about collaboration, is we have to be prepared to drop some of the barriers that exist. And we have to be not afraid to say, "I don't know," sometimes. And this is not practical. It's a little philosophical. It's a little epistemological, and a little psychological. So all that means is maybe it's not going to happen tomorrow, but we have to keep on talking about it.
I'm a big fan of Aldo Leopold. I'm glad to hear that you've cited him, but I don't think Aldo Leopold ever considered the landowner relationship to the land in the way that we see it today, where huge corporations own huge portions of states and donate hundreds of thousands of dollars into political campaigns, etc. Leopold was looking at a very personal relationship to the land. And I just wonder how we can translate Leopold's insights to a much larger system where policy seems to me to be largely determined among very large players who have, many of them are absentee owners, couldn't even understand the kind of relationship that Leopold looked forward to the land. And when you just look at the recent farm bill, for example, huge subsidies to large landowners, very little emphasis on removing marginal lands from production and so forth, emphasizing overproduction, etc. I just don't think that Leopold could recognize anything like the land ethic in the current approach to land management. Could you comment on that, please?
Sure, I'll comment on that. Understanding that it's a comment and that it's not a right or wrong answer. One of the things that I think that has to be borne in mind is that in the situation that you talk about, there are still people in those situations. There are individuals, large and small, and great and not so great, at the core of each of those situations. There are families who depend upon those situations for jobs large and small. And that's really at the core of this. And even beyond that, there are hundreds of thousands of people in this state and across the West in particular, who rely upon working landscapes that find themselves in potential crisis because they're not sure how to deal with the agencies that they have to deal with in order to have a rational way of getting through the Endangered Species Act. And I think that Aldo Leopold would find that very familiar, very familiar.
Judge Manson, Bill Snape with Defenders of Wildlife. I very much appreciated your tempered remarks this evening. I think we may have to agree to disagree on critical habitat, but I appreciated everything that you have said. However, some, including my group, Defenders, has criticized the administration for some of the administrative changes that it is making unilaterally. I'm talking about the self-consultation procedures that have been proposed for the Forest Service and BLM, similarly with regard to EPA and pesticides. But my question along that same line has to do with the international permit situation. And I was wondering whether you would be able to comment upon your view or the administration's view on the proposed rule to, in my view, weaken, but in your view, perhaps change the standards by which international endangered species permits are granted. And I guess as an aside on this, and I'm trying to ask this politely, but there's no other way to ask it but bluntly, is it true that the Safari Club International had a heavy hand in drafting that proposed rule?
Okay. Let me deal with the last part first. The answer to the last part is no, the Safari Club did not have a heavy hand in drafting it. The drafting of that actually got started really a number of years ago in the Fish and Wildlife Service's International Affairs Division, and all done by career employees, led by the chief of that division, Ken Stansel, who is one of the most well-respected individuals in the service and greatly respected in international conservation circles. One of the greatest experiences that I have had in this job was leading the U.S. delegation to CITES last year in Santiago. And one of the great joys about that was walking around with Ken Stansel and having people from all over the world walk up to Ken Stansel and treat him like a rock star in conservation terms. And Ken is largely responsible for that policy. Let me comment about the policy itself. First, I don't think it weakens the procedures for getting those permits. I think that it extends the policy to some circumstances where it's not been applied before. But philosophically, the underpinning of that policy is to incentivize the protection of species in situations where we have no regulatory control. You know, we can't tell Pakistan how to treat the markhor. If the markhor has no value to Pakistanis, there's nothing that we can do about that except give them incentives to conserve the species. And in fact, the draft policy actually goes beyond the requirements of CITES. CITES would require a no detriment finding, and the draft policy actually requires an enhancement finding before a permit will be granted. And it requires that the Fish and Wildlife Service examine the conservation program of the foreign country, and that's done on a permit-by-permit basis. And if the foreign country's conservation program falls below the standards that the service finds acceptable, then there will be no more permits in that country. And let me also say that the policy is at this point in draft. The comment period has closed, but we have received a number of comments from a wide variety of groups, and before the policy is finalized, we will analyze every one of those comments and take into account all of the comments that we've received.
Take one more question.
Okay, one more? Well, seeing none, I thank you once again for your hospitality, and as I said, I'll continue to participate tomorrow, and I appreciate all of your good work in all of your endeavors as we go through this process together. Thank you once again.